Well, you had some articles you were looking at, David, that I think were talking about, sort of this content, what's fake and what's real type of thing, right? So
Yeah. So something very kind of in a similar vein that happened fairly recently is that OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, but all the way back in January of this year, created a service that they were using called the let's see here, what was it called? The AI identifier. Or it was just meant to be a classifier to distinguish between text written by a human and text written by AIs from a variety of providers. So the entire purpose of the project was to be able to look at a block of text and to be able to identify whether it was generated by artificial intelligence or whether it was generated by humans. And that's a really, really interesting challenge because basically they just have to take all of their knowledge of how artificial intelligence generates text, how it goes about deciding what should go into a piece of text, and then determine how likely that is that it was generated by artificial intelligence. Because there's a technical difference. It's a lot easier to do with photos. It's a lot easier to do with photos because there is just this huge array of pixels, and it tends to draw from art that's already out there. It's a lot easier to identify it in art. In text, it's literally just text. Somebody could have just copied it from ChatGPT and put it onto their website. So it's a lot more challenging to identify it. And what they realized is that it was actually too challenging for them. 7 months later, just as of July 20th of 2023, the project got scrapped by OpenAI, and they are going to have to be completely reworking it. And so I think part of that goes to show just how challenging identifying AI-generated content is. But this article that I'm looking at from Business Insider is really interesting when it talks about the implications of it. And what it's saying is that there is this really interesting consequence that could happen of AI scraping the web. We talked a little bit about Google scraping the web a week or two ago, and AI scraping the web and then grabbing content that has already been generated by AI.
Right.
And what they realize is that this leads to a phenomenon called model collapse, where if an AI is getting fed content that was created by AI, it will eventually fold in on itself and collapse and be entirely useless because it's taking in unreal content.
They call it developing dementia, right?
Yeah.
So it turns out the models start forgetting the real distribution, and as the process repeats, models develop dementia, I think is the quote from, or there's a... Is it a tweet anymore, David? I don't know. It's an X.
Who knows? Who knows? Elon, help.
That somebody's saying this is dementia. I thought that was really interesting. This idea that we've talked a while ago about what happens if, and I think we've talked privately about, so it spins up and then within a couple of years, 70-80% of the internet is all AI generated. But this is basically saying if 80% of the internet is AI generated, then at some point the models collapse because there's no new. Yeah. Break that down, David. Is that your understanding what they're saying here? Is that, So let me pause this and see if I get this right. So 80% of the internet becomes AI generated, or, put some substantial number in there.
Yep.
AI models are trained on the internet. AI models now go out and are just regurgitating AI generated stuff. And then that leads to model collapse. So is that, so you're nodding. So that's the thesis. Yep. So that has a really fascinating implication, which is basically AI doesn't work without outside creativity. Is that, did I logically get to that? That's kind of a pretty stunning. Yeah. There's a bigger implication than Business Insider maybe sort of puts in this article here. So,
I completely agree. That's exactly the implication that I came to, is the fact that we have talked a lot about just some of the dangers and the risks of artificial intelligence, and how a lot of people have concerns about artificial intelligence taking the place of humans. But it's just fascinating to see how one of the major concerns for the future of artificial intelligence, as we understand it, is a lack of new human input. and the fact that artificial intelligence and its future could potentially be hamstrung by a lack of human creativity and human data to be put into it.
Yeah, that's really has some extremely fascinating. I mean, to some extent, that is almost a reiteration that it is a machine. Like my car will run forever as long as it has gasoline. But not really forever because it'll eventually break down. But the point is that, you have to input the gasoline. Somebody's got to, it's got to have an outside energy source that comes in for it to continue to run. And in this sense, the outside energy source is creativity. So there's a bit of an interesting analogy there. But this article is basically saying that without that outside energy input, in this case, creativity, new content, that you'll lead to model collapse. I think that's fascinating. I think Business Insider is more like saying, hey, the story is that OpenAI tried to identify text, couldn't do it, and shut it down. But I think the bigger story here is that, hey, if you don't have new stuff coming in, these models collapse and develop dementia, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and then I think that leads into a further issue of then how do we handle if we are going to continue using AI as we understand it, how are we going to go about collecting that new data? Because there is a lot of concern about how AI goes about collecting data. And I think now, especially with this concern about model collapse, that AI companies are going to start to be much more cautious about how they go about collecting data, because they have to recognize that if we just go and collect anything and everything, then there's a good chance that we could just be collecting AI generated stuff, and we need to be able to determine that. And so if they're only going after human created stuff, I think then that gives a little bit more of a leg up to creators who want to be able to say, hey, no, you can't have my creative work to train your AI on. Right. And so there's, I think, going to be potentially this balance of AI creators who are needing new creative input, and creators who want to get their work out there might not be crazy about the idea of giving their content to an AI company. But eventually, because of the fact that we are in an economic world, there is going to start to be economics incentive, I think, for creatives who are willing to give permission to have their content scraped by AI.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. And if you're listening, and once again, we say that, people that sort of get early, start thinking about this early, tend to be the people that are going to be the innovators that drive this. I mean, there's a whole model here, right? Mm-hmm. So just one thing that just sort of comes to mind, David, is that, if you could develop a system that would identify an AI scraping your site, and you would develop code that would prevent AI from scraping your site, there's a whole ecosystem right there, right? And so it's not hard to imagine a situation where websites now come standard with a set of blocking code that keeps AI crawlers from going across them. And then there's a marketplace. And so, in fact, you might actually sell access to certain AI crawlers for a small fee, maybe a la, iTunes and Spotify, stuff like that. This could be a music industry redo here, right? Where content creators are saying, no, it's blocked unless you pay a small fee. And if you pay a small fee, then you can use your AI to learn from some of my content. And there may actually be economic incentive to do that. That's not a certainty by any stretch, but it's, based on this model, based on this article, there's some interesting potential there. And I think there is definitely going to be economic incentive for people to develop code that will stop AI crawlers from taking content off your site. That seems to be I think that's a pretty good bet, that if you could figure out a way to develop that you'd be in demand. So,
hey, thank you so much for listening into this clip of the Alternative Ideas podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more of them just like it, you can view some other clips like this one and the full episodes right here on the Alternative Ideas YouTube channel.